3 weeks. That's how long it had been since I last heard my son's voice. I'd left messages, called at odd hours, even sent him old photos of Philip, his boy, my grandson, hoping it might spark a reply. Nothing. Silence where his laughter should have been, where his sarcasm usually colored our conversations. At first, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe work at the plant was too much. Maybe he was struggling again, trying to get back on his feet after another slip with gambling. Mark wasn't perfect, but he had a good heart. He always called me back. Always. That's how I knew something was deeply wrong. Vivian, his ex-wife, was no help. When I finally worked up the nerve to call her, she brushed me off with that sugary tone she always used, the kind that hid poison beneath. "Oh, he's probably fine," she said. "You know Mark, he gets in these moods." No, I thought. This wasn't a mood. This was different. The worry turned me inside out, eating at me until the weight of it sat on my chest each night, pressing harder with every unanswered call. 2 weeks of that torment broke me, and I drove to his house in Columbus, Ohio. The place was too quiet, blinds drawn against the September sun. His mailbox overflowed with bills and ads, like time itself had stopped on his porch. I knocked. No answer. I knocked harder. Still nothing. But then I heard it. A sound. Faint, muffled, trembling. My heart pounded as I forced my way inside. The air smelled stale, heavy, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. I followed the noise, my steps echoing down the basement stairs. That's where I found him. Philip, my sweet 8-year-old grandson, crouched behind boxes, eyes wide with terror. His lips trembled, but no words came. His small body shook as if it hadn't felt safety in days. "Where's Daddy?" I whispered, kneeling beside him. He only shook his head, his silence heavier than any scream. That's when the dread sank into my bones. My son was gone, and whatever secret had swallowed him whole was now spilling into the basement of his own home. Later that night, as I stood in the backyard, I noticed the storage shed door. Locked tight, too tight, and I swear, as I stood there, holding Philip's trembling hand, something shifted inside. Something moved. That was the beginning of a nightmare I never could have imagined. Before I dive deeper into this story, I want to pause here. Writing this and reliving every detail takes hours of energy and emotion. It's not easy. If you appreciate hearing my story and want me to keep sharing the full journey, please consider subscribing. Every bit of support makes it possible for me to keep going. I'm a 56-year-old grandmother living just outside Cleveland, Ohio. I've worked as a school secretary for nearly 2 decades. My life hasn't been glamorous, but it's been filled with purpose, raising my children, watching them stumble and helping them stand again. Mark was my oldest, my first child. He was headstrong, charming, reckless at times, but he was mine. A boy who grew up fishing at Lake Erie with his father, who'd once promised me he'd always take care of Philip no matter what. Vivian came into the picture young. She was beautiful, sharp, the kind of woman who could light up a room, but also cut you down with a single look. She and Mark married too quickly, and the cracks showed fast. Their fights were legendary. Money, gambling, jealousy. By the time Philip was 5, the marriage was over. But Vivian wasn't just an ex-wife. She was a storm that never passed. Manipulative, self-serving, always playing the victim in public while twisting the knife in private. I tolerated her for Philip's sake, but I never trusted her. Not fully. And now, with my son missing, she was the one telling me he was probably fine. No, something wasn't right. As I tucked Philip into bed that night in my guest room, I sat by his side, smoothing his hair back. He still hadn't spoken a single word. Trauma can silence a child in ways no adult can understand. I recognized that silence. It was a silence that screamed. I promised him I'd find his father. I promised him he wasn't alone. But deep down, I knew. I wasn't just looking for my son anymore. I was walking straight into a web I couldn't yet see, one spun from greed, betrayal, and secrets buried too deep. And the first strand of that web lay locked inside. If you were in my shoes, finding your grandson like that, your child missing without a trace, would you have gone straight to the police? Or would you, like me, start digging yourself? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. The next morning, I woke up restless, the memory of that shed gnawing at me. All night, I'd replayed the sound in my head, the faint shuffle, the undeniable impression that something or someone had been inside. My rational mind told me it could have been a raccoon, a stray cat, even the wind. But my gut told me otherwise. Philip ate quietly at the breakfast table, still refusing to speak. I tried coaxing him with pancakes, his favorite, but the silence remained. His small hands trembled when I reached for them, and I realized that forcing answers from him would only deepen the wound. I had to get answers elsewhere. By noon, I drove back to Mark's house in Columbus. The street looked normal enough. Neighbors watering their lawns, a delivery truck idling down the block. But the house itself stood out, a hollow shell on a street full of life. The shed sat in the backyard, its padlock gleaming under the September sun. I circled it slowly, listening, waiting, almost daring the sound to return. At first, nothing, just the hum of distant traffic. Then, faintly, I heard it again. A shuffle, a scrape. I gripped the lock, pulling on it until the metal bit into my palms. Whoever had locked it had meant for it to stay locked. I should have gone to the police then, reported my son missing, told them about the shed, about Philip's state. But here's the truth. I didn't trust the police to care the way I cared. Mark had a record, petty gambling charges, a couple of bad debts. To them, he'd be just another man who'd probably run off. To me, he was my boy, my responsibility. So I went to the hardware store instead. By the time I returned, a bolt cutter sat heavy in my hands. My heart thudded as I stood before the lock. One clean snap, and I'd know the truth. But before I could cut it, a voice startled me. "Can I help you with something?" I turned to see a man standing at the edge of the yard. Tall, mid-40s, with a sharpness in his eyes I didn't like. He had the kind of face you'd forget in a crowd. But something about him lingered, maybe the way he was watching me too closely. "I'm Mark's mother," I said firmly. "Do you live nearby?" He nodded. "Across the street. Haven't seen him around lately. House looks empty." His eyes flicked to the bolt cutter in my hand. "What are you planning to do?" "I'm worried about my son," I said. "I have to check." He gave a small shrug, lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Well, I hope you find him. People like your boy, they get themselves into all kinds of trouble." Before I could respond, he walked off, disappearing down the block. A chill crawled up my spine. He knew something. I was certain of it. Shaking, I returned to the shed. With one swift motion, I cut the lock. The clang of it falling to the ground echoed, louder than it should have. I pulled the door open, bracing myself. Inside, the air reeked of dampness and rust. Boxes stacked high, tools scattered, and in the corner a dark stain across the concrete floor. I froze. My throat tightened while rising. It wasn't fresh, but it was unmistakable. Blood. That was the moment everything changed. This wasn't just worry anymore. This was terror. I staggered back, my hand covering my mouth. Whoever had been in that shed, whatever had happened there, it wasn't just about gambling debts or stress. It was something far darker. And I knew then, Vivian's fake sweetness, the neighbor's too watchful eyes, my grandson's silence, it was all connected. I called her that night. "Vivian," I said, my voice shaking but firm, "if you know something about Mark, you need to tell me now." Her laugh came soft, practiced. "Oh, don't start with your dramatics. I told you he's fine." But underneath her tone, I caught it. A crack, a hesitation, and I realized I wasn't just looking for my missing son anymore. I was standing at the edge of a secret that could destroy everything. The nightmare had just begun. If you were in my shoes, standing there with a bolt cutter, opening that shed, would you have gone through with it or walked away and left it to the police? I'm curious how others might have handled it. Let me know in the comments. The sight of that dark stain in the shed haunted me. I couldn't scrub it from my mind, no matter how hard I tried. When I closed my eyes, it spread wider, seeping across the concrete, swallowing every ounce of hope I'd clung to. I drove home with my knuckles white on the steering wheel, Philip asleep in the back seat. His silence was a weight that pressed heavier with every mile. He hadn't asked about his father, hadn't said a single word since I found him. It was as though the truth he carried inside had welded his lips shut. That night, after I tucked him into bed, I poured myself a glass of cheap red wine, something to dull the edge. But the moment the bitterness hit my tongue, I slammed the glass down. I couldn't escape it. The shed, the stain, Vivian's voice in my ear. It all circled back, whispering the same truth I didn't want to say out loud. Something had happened to my son, and someone knew. I paced the kitchen floor, fighting the urge to call 911. But what would I say? My son's gone, there's blood in his shed, and his 8-year-old boy won't speak. I imagined the officer on the other end, his voice flat, his tone skeptical. They'd ask about Mark's past, his debts, his mistakes. They'd assume he skipped town, running from another bad bet. No, if justice was going to come for my son, it wouldn't come from a police report. It would come from me. The next day, I drove back to Columbus, determined to face Vivian in person. Her house sat in a newer development just outside Dublin, 2 stories of polished brick with a manicured lawn. Perfect on the outside, rotten at the core. She answered the door in yoga pants and a spotless white sweatshirt, her blonde hair pulled back like she had nothing to hide. Her smile was thin, brittle. "Well, look who it is," she said. "Come to check up on me?" I stepped inside without asking. "I know something's happened to Mark," I said. My voice was steady, though inside I was shaking. "And I know you're lying to me." Her eyes narrowed, just for a second, before her face snapped back into that practiced sweetness. "You've always loved your dramatics. Maybe you finally had enough of your hovering and decided to take a break." I leaned closer. Philip was hiding in the basement, Vivian. Alone. Terrified. He hasn't seen his father in days. And I found blood in the shed. The words landed heavy between us. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in her eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by that same cruel smile. "Maybe he cut himself," she said casually, walking toward the kitchen. "Mark's clumsy like that." That was it, the crack in her armor. She was lying, and she wasn't even trying to hide it well. Rage boiled inside me, hotter than I'd ever felt before. "You listen to me," I said, my voice low sharp. "Whatever game you're playing, whatever you think you're covering up, I will find out the truth. And when I do, you won't be able to sweet talk your way out of it." She turned, smirk painted on her lips. "You've always thought you were smarter than everyone else. Maybe this time, you're in over your head." I left her standing there, the door slamming behind me. My heart pounded, my hands trembling. For the first time in weeks, I felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't just about finding Mark anymore. This was about destroying the lies Vivian had built her life on. And I wasn't going to wait for someone else to do it for me. That night, as I lay awake listening to Philip's soft breathing down the hall, a decision crystallized inside me. Enough of the pleading. Enough of the waiting. If the world wanted to turn its back on my son, then I would be the one to fight for him. And Vivian had just made herself my first target. The drive back from Vivian's house was a blur. The highway stretched endlessly, the lines on the asphalt blurring into streaks beneath my tires. My mind wasn't on the road. It was replaying her words, her smirk, the cold dismissal in her voice. "Maybe you're in over your head." That line echoed like a dare, a challenge. And for the first time, I realized she wasn't just dismissing me, she was warning me. Vivian knew more than she was letting on. When I pulled into my driveway in Cleveland, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house I'd lived in for 22 years. The porch light flickered faintly, the hydrangeas I'd planted in the spring now beginning to wilt. Ordinary, familiar, safe. And yet, my life had just crossed a line where ordinary could no longer exist. Inside, I checked on Philip. He was curled up in bed, his small body dwarfed by the quilt. His face was pale, the innocence of childhood stolen too soon. I thought of Mark at that age, his mop of brown hair, the way he'd chase fireflies in our backyard until I had to drag him inside. He'd been a boy full of light, full of promise. And now silence, a missing son, a bloodstained shed, an ex-wife hiding something behind her polished smile. I sat on the edge of my own bed that night, staring into the dark. Fear gnawed at me, but beneath it, something else burned hotter. Determination. Rage. I wasn't going to be the mother who waited quietly for answers that never came. I wasn't going to let my grandson grow up with whispers of a father who abandoned him. I was going to find the truth, no matter what it cost me. And if Vivian had a hand in whatever happened to Mark, I was going to tear down everything she'd built, piece by piece. That thought scared me. I'm not a cruel woman by nature. I've lived my life quietly, modestly, believing in hard work and fairness. But life has a way of shifting you when the stakes are high enough. This wasn't just about revenge. It was survival. Survival for Philip, for Mark's memory, for the truth. Over the next few days, I started piecing together a plan. It began simply, a notebook on my kitchen table, pages filled with observations, timelines, questions. Why was Philip in the basement? Who was the man across the street, watching me too closely? What debts did Mark still owe? Why was Vivian so quick to dismiss my concerns? The more I wrote, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't random. This was orchestrated. I thought back to the day Mark told me about his gambling debts, years earlier. He'd been 29, sitting at my kitchen table, his hands shaking as he confessed he owed money to people he couldn't name out loud. I remember grabbing his hands, telling him we'd figure it out together. But had he ever really gotten free? Or had the debts only grown worse? That night, I searched through old boxes in my attic until I found what I was looking for. Mark's old insurance papers. He'd taken out a policy years ago when Philip was born. I hadn't thought about it in years, but the moment I saw it, my blood ran cold. If Mark was gone, Vivian stood to gain. And not just a little. I sat there, the papers trembling in my hands, as a realization struck me like lightning. This wasn't just about gambling. This was about greed. And Vivian had every motive in the world to make my son disappear. I closed the box, my jaw tight. I'd spent weeks being afraid, letting silence and dread control me. But that night, in the quiet of my attic, surrounded by old papers and dust, I felt something shift deep inside. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry. And anger, I knew, could be turned into power if wielded carefully. That was the night I became someone else. Not just a mother searching for her son, but a woman ready to burn down every lie standing in her way. It's only someone who supports betrayal and injustice who would ignore a story like this. If you believe in truth and in a mother's fight for her child, then don't just listen, subscribe. Your support is the only reason I can keep sharing what really happened. The morning after I found Mark's old insurance papers, I sat at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee and a yellow legal pad. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, and Philip's soft breathing carried faintly from down the hall. I had made up my mind the night before. If Vivian thought she could erase my son and collect her reward in silence, she had chosen the wrong opponent. But anger alone doesn't build justice. It takes strategy. So I began small. The first step was information. Vivian thrived on secrets, spinning half-truths into believable stories. If I was going to fight her, I needed to take away her shadows and drag everything into the light. I started with public records. The Franklin County Clerk's office wasn't glamorous, but it was thorough. I spent an afternoon scrolling through court filings, financial liens, property records. It was tedious work, the kind that makes your eyes blur and your back ache, but it paid off. Vivian's name appeared on several filings. Unpaid credit cards, a dispute with a contractor over remodeling costs, a repossessed BMW from 2 years ago. Her life looked polished on the outside, but underneath it was bleeding debt. Greed. That was her weakness. As I scrolled further, I spotted something else, something that turned my stomach. 3 months earlier, she had inquired about cashing out a life insurance policy. Not her own, not her parents', Mark's. I sat back in the library chair, my hands trembling. She had known. She had planned. But how do you take information like that to the police when you don't yet have a body? Without proof, it was just suspicion, and suspicion was fragile. It could break easily under Vivian's rehearsed charm. So instead, I decided to weaken her where she least expected it, her image. Vivian lived for appearances. She was the woman who made sure her lawn was perfect, her nails immaculate, her smile flawless. But behind the glass, she was cracking. I could see it in the records, in the debts stacking higher, in the faint quiver in her voice when I confronted her. I started small. I attended a neighborhood fundraiser she frequented, one of those charity brunches at a country club in Upper Arlington, where women wore pearls and traded gossip like currency. I hadn't been invited, but that didn't stop me. When Vivian spotted me across the room, her smile faltered just for a second, but then she recovered, gliding toward me with her usual grace. "What a surprise," she said sweetly. "I didn't know you were on the guest list." "I wasn't," I replied, "but I figured it was time I showed up where people actually listened." Her eyes narrowed, though her smile didn't break. She leaned closer. "Careful, darling. This isn't the place for theatrics." "Oh, I agree," I whispered back. "It's the place for truth." Then I turned, my voice just loud enough for the circle of women around us to hear. "Has anyone seen my son lately?" I asked. "It's been weeks. He's missing, and Vivian here doesn't seem too concerned." A ripple moved through the group. Vivian laughed lightly, but I could see the stiffness in her shoulders. "She's exaggerating," she said quickly. "Mark has always been a little unpredictable." But the seed was planted. Whispers spread like wildfire in that room. I didn't need to accuse her outright. I just needed to let doubt creep in. That night, I drove home and wrote everything down in my notebook. Every expression, every hesitation, every detail mattered. Revenge wasn't about blowing up the battlefield in one strike. It was about cutting off oxygen, one breath at a time. The next move came a few days later. I contacted one of Mark's old friends, a man named David who used to gamble with him at the Hollywood Casino in Columbus. He was surprised to hear from me, but when I explained Mark was missing, he invited me to meet at a diner off Broad Street. David was rough around the edges, his hair thinning, his hands calloused. He stirred his coffee nervously, glancing around as though afraid to be overheard. "Mark owed money," he admitted finally. "A lot of money. To people you don't want to owe. Last I heard, he was trying to work out a deal." "What kind of deal?" I pressed. He shook his head. "I don't know. But his ex-wife, she came around once, asking questions about who he owed. Made me uneasy. Why would she care unless she was in on it somehow?" My chest tightened. The puzzle pieces were clicking together, but the picture was uglier than I'd imagined. When I drove home that night, Philip was sitting in the living room, sketching with crayons. He still hadn't spoken, but when I sat beside him, he leaned into me. And then, softly, almost too faint to hear, he whispered, "Grandma." Tears pricked my eyes. His voice was cracked, rusty from disuse, but it was there. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, stroking his hair. "I'm right here." He pointed toward the window, toward the darkness outside. "Don't let her take me." I froze. My arms tightened around him. He didn't say who her was. He didn't need to. That night, as I held him until he fell asleep, I knew one thing for certain. Vivian wasn't just hiding the truth. She was dangerous. And if I wanted to protect Philip, I couldn't just gather evidence. I had to dismantle her world piece by piece. The next morning, I started making calls. Quiet calls. I reached out to a teacher I knew in the Columbus School District who'd had run-ins with Vivian. I spoke with a realtor who had once tried to sell her house and complained about her creative handling of money. Each conversation was another thread pulled loose. Vivian had enemies, plenty of them, and I was going to make sure their voices joined mine. It was only someone who supports injustice that would look at a story like this. A missing man, a child silenced by fear, a mother digging for truth and not show their support. Don't be that person. Subscribe, because your support is how I'll keep exposing everything that happened. The fire was lit. The slow burn had begun. And soon, Vivian would feel the heat. By the time October rolled in, I had already planted enough seeds of doubt in Vivian's pristine world to know the harvest was coming. Doubt spreads fast. It doesn't need proof, just suspicion. And suspicion is like smoke. Once people smell it, they start looking for fire. The first fallout came through whispers. My friend from the school district called me one Tuesday morning, her voice brimming with barely concealed excitement. "You won't believe what I overheard in the teacher's lounge," she said. One of the parents was talking about Vivian. Said she's been skipping Philip's school meetings, said she looked, well, strung out. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. Did anyone mention Mark? There was a pause. They said she made a joke about him running off again. But no one laughed. People think something's off. That was all I needed. Once Vivian lost her grip on appearances, she'd be fighting battles on every front. The second strike came from the financial side. I'd reached out quietly to an old co-worker of mine, Ellen, who had a cousin working at a bank in downtown Columbus. It was a long shot, but Ellen owed me a favor. A week later, I had what I needed. Vivian had applied for a loan and been denied. Twice. The reason? Too much existing debt. Looks like she's been juggling credit cards, Ellen told me. She's desperate for money. Desperate people make mistakes. And when they do, the consequences aren't far behind. But the most satisfying moment came at a PDA fundraiser at Philip's school. I hadn't planned to attend. I'd been trying to keep Philip sheltered from all of it, but when another grandmother called to say Vivian was on the committee, I knew I had to go. The event was held in the school gymnasium, streamers hanging limp from the basketball hoops, the faint smell of popcorn in the air. Parents milled about, sipping from styrofoam cups, while kids darted between tables stacked with silent auction items. Vivian stood near the raffle table, her smile stretched thin, her laugh a beat too loud. I watched her carefully, noting the way her eyes darted toward the door every few minutes, like she was expecting someone. Then it happened. One of the mothers, Lisa, a woman I'd spoken to quietly weeks earlier, approached Vivian with a sharp smile, loud enough for several others to hear. She asked, "So, Vivian, have you heard from Mark lately? His mother said he's been missing for weeks. Should we be worried?" The color drained from Vivian's face. She recovered quickly, of course, she always did. But the damage was done. I saw the way the other parents leaned in, their curiosity piqued, their trust beginning to erode. "Oh, please," Vivian said, her voice brittle. "Mark has always been unreliable. He probably ran off to Vegas again." But no one laughed. That silence was sweeter than anything I could have planned. It was the sound of her armor cracking. When she caught sight of me across the room, her eyes burned with fury. I didn't look away. I wanted her to know I was behind it. I wanted her to feel the heat of the truth closing in. Later that night, when I tucked Philip into bed, I found a drawing on his nightstand. A house, a stick-figure child, and in the corner, a dark red scribble that looked like a locked box. "Did you draw this, sweetheart?" I asked softly. He nodded, eyes downcast. Is this about Daddy?" For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then, in a whisper, he said she locked the door. My blood ran cold. Vivian hadn't just lied. She hadn't just schemed. Philip had seen something. He had been there. That night, as I sat alone at the kitchen table with the drawing in my hands, I realized the slow burn wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. Philip was the key, and if Vivian sensed he might talk, she'd come for him. I had to stay ahead of her. The very next day, I called Child Protective Services. I didn't give them every detail, not yet. But I filed a concern. Neglect. Emotional harm. I told them Philip had been left alone in a basement for days. The woman on the line took notes, her voice calm but urgent. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll follow up." I hung up, my heart racing. It wasn't the police, not yet, but it was a move. One that would make Vivian squirm. And sure enough, 2 days later, she called me. "You bitch," she hissed into the phone, her mask stripped away. "You think you can turn people against me? You think you can ruin me? You did that yourself," I said, my voice steady. "And it's only just beginning." The line went dead. But I knew in that moment I had her exactly where I wanted her. Angry, unraveling, desperate. What Vivian didn't know was that I was just getting started. If you were in my place, holding that crayon drawing, hearing Philip whisper those words, would you have gone straight to the police or taken the slow approach like I did? I need to know if others would have risked it differently. Tell me in the comments. The call from Vivian came 2 days after her furious outburst on the phone. I almost didn't answer when I saw her name flash across the screen. But something inside me told me it was important. Her voice was softer this time, shaky even. "We need to talk," she said. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence stretch. "Please," she added. "Not on the phone. In person." Against my better judgment, I agreed. But I made sure we chose neutral ground. A cafe off High Street in downtown Columbus, the kind of place where businessmen lingered over laptops and college students crowded around tables. Public. Safe. When I arrived, Vivian was already there, seated in the corner with sunglasses perched on her head. She looked different, less polished, more frayed around the edges. The mask she always wore seemed to be slipping. "Thank you for coming," she said, her smile weak. I slid into the chair opposite her. "Cut the act, Vivian. What do you want?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I know you've been talking. To people. About me. People deserve to know the truth," I said. Her eyes flickered. For a moment, I thought I saw fear, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into," she whispered. "You think you're helping, but you're making it worse. For you. For Philip." The way she said his name, Philip, like it was a weapon. My stomach knotted. "What happened to my son?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. She didn't answer. Instead, she glanced toward the window, as if checking to see who might be watching. Then she leaned closer. "Mark wasn't innocent. He made choices. Choices that dragged all of us down. You want someone to blame, but maybe you should be looking at him." Rage surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You're lying. And one day, Vivian, the lies won't protect you." Her jaw tightened. She reached into her purse, pulled out a folded envelope, and slid it across the table. "You need to stop," she said. "For your own sake. For Philip's." I didn't touch it. "What's this?" "A way out," she said. Her voice was flat now, the sweetness gone. "Walk away before you dig too deep." I stared at the envelope, then back at her. "You killed him, didn't you?" I asked. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. That silence told me more than any words could. I pushed the envelope back toward her. "I don't want your way out. I want the truth." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're going to regret this," she hissed, before storming out of the cafe. I sat there, my hands trembling, the eyes of nearby patrons glancing curiously in my direction. I'd wanted answers, but what I got was a warning. Vivian was unraveling, but she was also dangerous. When I returned home, Philip was waiting in the living room, clutching one of his drawings. This one was different. It showed two stick figures, one tall, one small, standing together. And behind them, a larger figure with sharp, jagged lines around it like a shadow. He handed it to me silently. "Is this her?" I asked gently. He nodded, his eyes filling with tears. I pulled him into my arms, holding him tight. "She won't hurt you," I whispered. "I promise." But inside, I wondered if I could keep that promise. Vivian had made her threat clear. She wanted me to stop. She thought fear would silence me. But all she had done was ignite something even stronger. I wasn't walking away. Not now. Not ever. If you were sitting across from Vivian in that cafe, if she slid an envelope across the table and told you to stop, would you take it? Or would you push it back like I did? Tell me in the comments, because I wonder how many people would risk what I risked that day. After the meeting at the cafe, I couldn't stop thinking about the envelope. I hadn't opened it, hadn't even touched it, but its weight lingered in my mind like a stone pressing down on my chest. What had she tried to offer me? Money? Proof? A threat written in neat little lines? That night, I lay awake long after Philip had fallen asleep. The house creaked with its usual old bones, but every sound felt magnified, sharper, as though Vivian herself might burst through the door at any moment. I thought about redemption, about whether people like her could ever change. I've spent my whole life believing people could be saved. That was what I told myself when Mark first confessed his gambling problems. That's what I told him when he lost his job, when he pawned his belongings, when he promised he'd get better. I believed in him, even when he stumbled, because he was my son. But Vivian? She wasn't stumbling. She was calculating. She was orchestrating. Still, a part of me wondered, had she always been this way? Or had desperation twisted her into someone unrecognizable? The next morning, my question was answered in the harshest way possible. I opened my front door to grab the morning paper and found something taped to the glass. A single Polaroid photo. It was of me, taken from the yard, through the window, as I sat at the kitchen table with Philip the night before. My blood ran cold. I scanned the street, but there was no one in sight. Just the quiet hum of suburban life. But someone had been there, close enough to capture that moment. Watching us. I tore the photo down, my hands trembling. This wasn't Vivian trying to redeem herself. This was Vivian showing me how far she was willing to go. The fear should have broken me. Instead, it hardened me. Later that day, I made a choice. I wasn't just going to expose her lies through whispers and gossip anymore. I was going to pull her whole world into the open. I started with her finances. Using the records I'd gathered, I contacted a local journalist I'd once met at a school fundraiser, a young man named Chris who worked for the Columbus Dispatch. I laid it out carefully, piece by piece. The debts, the denied loans, the inquiry into Mark's insurance. Chris was skeptical at first. It's thin, he admitted, but it's a start. If I dig and find more, are you ready to go on record? Yes, I said without hesitation. Whatever it takes. That night, Vivian called again. Her voice was sharp, brittle. You're making a mistake, she spat. You're dragging everyone into something you don't understand. I understand perfectly, I said. You're afraid. Silence. Then the line went dead. It wasn't redemption I heard in her voice that night. It was desperation. Over the next week, small cracks became fissures. The parents at Philip's school whispered louder. The PTA president quietly dropped Vivian from her committee duties, and Chris confirmed he'd uncovered more. Payments made to a consultant with ties to a loan shark ring operating out of Dayton. Vivian's polished image was collapsing, and she knew it. One evening, as I tucked Philip into bed, he whispered again, his voice a little stronger than before. Daddy didn't leave. I froze. What do you mean, sweetheart? His eyes filled with tears. I heard her. I heard her say he wasn't coming back. My heart shattered, but at the same time, I felt the fire inside me grow. Vivian had crossed the line. Whatever scraps of redemption might have existed for her were gone. This wasn't about saving her. It was about stopping her. And I was going to make sure she had nowhere left to hide. It's only someone who supports injustice who would look at what Vivian has done, at the fear she put into my grandson, at the lies she spun, and stay silent. If you believe in truth, in justice, and in protecting children, then show it. Subscribe, because silence is what people like Vivian count on. By mid-October, the whispers about Vivian had turned into conversations. Conversations into rumors, and rumors into questions she could no longer avoid. Chris, the journalist, had published a short piece in the Columbus Dispatch, hinting at financial irregularities tied to a prominent local figure. He hadn't named her outright, but anyone who moved in her circle knew who he meant. I could almost feel the walls closing in on her. The calls from school started first. We've noticed Vivian hasn't been attending Philip's conferences, the principal said carefully. Given the circumstances, we'd like to know if custody needs to be formally reviewed. Custody. The word made my stomach flip. That was the door I'd been waiting to pry open. Vivian's grip on Philip was weakening, and if the system caught wind of her instability, I could make sure she never hurt him again. But the closer I got, the more dangerous Vivian became. One evening, as I walked Philip home from the park, I felt eyes on us. Not just the casual glances of passing strangers, but a steady gaze. I turned quickly and caught a glimpse of a car idling at the curb. A black sedan, the driver's face hidden in shadow. When I quickened my pace, so did the car. Only when we reached my driveway did it pull away, tires screeching. Philip clung to my arm, trembling. She's watching us, he whispered. I didn't deny it, because I knew he was right. That night, I placed an extra lock on the front door and moved a chair against the back one. My house had always been a place of warmth and safety, but now it felt like a fortress under siege. The next morning, Chris called me again. His voice was urgent. I found something else. Vivian's been trying to cash out on the insurance policy. She's been making calls, pressuring the company. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles whitened. Can they stop her? They can delay it. But without proof of death, she won't get anywhere. Proof of death. The words cut into me. That's what she was waiting for. That's what she was building toward. And yet she was running out of time. The The cracks in her life were visible everywhere. At the grocery store, I overheard two women whispering about her debts. At Philip's school, another parent told me Vivian had shown up late to pick him up, looking disheveled and distracted. Even her own neighbor confided to me that her once perfect lawn had gone to weeds. Vivian was unraveling, and I was the one pulling at the threads. But she wasn't going down quietly. One afternoon, as I returned home from errands, I found my mailbox stuffed with papers. Not bills, not ads, court documents. Vivian had filed a petition, an emergency motion, claiming I was trying to alienate Philip from her. I sank into a kitchen chair, the papers spread before me. The audacity, the sheer gall. She was trying to paint herself as the victim, to twist the system in her favor the same way she twisted everything else. But as I read further, a spark of grim satisfaction lit inside me. Her motion was sloppy. Dates wrong, details inconsistent. The cracks in her mask weren't just showing, they were widening into chasms. This wasn't just a battle for Mark anymore. It was a battle for Philip. That night, Philip drew another picture. This one showed a stick figure behind bars. "Is that her?" I asked. He nodded solemnly. I kissed his forehead. "Then that's where she'll end up," I promised. But promises weren't enough. I needed to act. The next morning, I called Chris again. "Push harder," I told him. "Print her name. Don't let her hide anymore." He hesitated. "That could trigger something ugly." "I know," I said, "but she's already playing ugly, and I'm done waiting." For the first time, I felt the scales tipping in my favor. Vivian was desperate, cornered, and afraid. But cornered animals are dangerous, and I knew before this ended, she would strike again. Have you ever had someone twist the truth against you so blatantly that you wondered if the world would believe them instead of you? That's the game Vivian was playing. I'd like to know in the comments how you would fight back in my shoes. I'd been waiting for the storm, waiting for the moment Vivian stopped hiding behind whispers and court filings and finally showed her teeth. I knew it was coming. Every cornered animal strikes when it feels the walls pressing too tight. But I wasn't ready for how viciously it came. It started on a Thursday evening. I'd just finished washing the dinner dishes when I heard a thud outside. Not the kind of sound you mistake for a branch or a raccoon, but something deliberate. I hurried to the front door and found it. Another envelope. This one wasn't neat or folded carefully like the one she'd slid across the cafe table. It was crumpled, dirty, the ink smudged from hurried hands. Inside was a single piece of paper with block letters cut from magazines and glued into words. "Stop or the boy disappears next." My knees buckled. For a moment, the world blurred. I gripped the doorframe until my knuckles ached, the letter trembling in my hands. "Philip." I tore through the house until I found him in the living room, safe, curled up on the couch with one of his drawings. Relief flooded me, but rage followed close behind. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was a declaration of war. I knew I couldn't sit on this one. I drove straight to the Columbus police station, the letter in hand. My voice shook as I explained, but I forced myself to be clear. My son is missing. His ex-wife is trying to cash out his life insurance policy. She left this at my door. And my grandson, her own child, saw something he hasn't been able to say out loud. The officer on duty frowned, flipping the letter over. "Do you have proof it was her?" I clenched my jaw. "Proof? She's been watching my house, leaving photos, filing false motions in court. She threatened me in person." The officer sighed, the kind of sigh that said he'd heard too many stories like this. "We'll file a report, but without direct evidence, there's only so much we can do." That's when something inside me snapped. I slammed my palm on the counter, the sound echoing through the room. "If you won't protect my family, I will. And when you find my son's body, remember that I begged you to listen." The officer's eyes widened. Maybe it was my fury, maybe it was the desperation in my voice. But for once, he didn't dismiss me outright. He nodded slowly. "We'll look into it." It wasn't enough, but it was something. When I got home that night, Philip was asleep on the couch. Beside him was another drawing. This one stopped my heart cold. It showed two figures, his father and Vivian. One lying on the ground, the other standing over him with something in her hand. A stick, A pipe, I couldn't tell. But I didn't need to. Philip had seen it. I sat there for hours, staring at that picture. The truth was no longer a shadow, it was in crayon, in the trembling hand of an 8-year-old boy. Vivian had killed my son, and now she was threatening to take Philip too. The slow burn of my revenge had carried me this far, but this was different. This was the storm breaking wide open. The next day, Chris published a full article. This time, he named her. Local woman under scrutiny amid missing person investigation and financial irregularities. Her photo sat right at the top. The fallout was immediate. Parents pulled their children from playdates with her. Her employer placed her on administrative leave. Her name was whispered in every grocery store, every cafe, every church pew. And that evening, she came to me. I heard the knock at the door just after dark. 3 sharp raps, insistent. I froze, then peered through the window. Vivian. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale, her eyes wild. I opened the door just a crack. What do you want? She shoved her way inside before I could stop her. You think you're so clever, she hissed. You think you can turn the whole world against me? You did that yourself, I said coldly. She stepped closer, her face inches from mine. You don't understand who you're dealing with. Mark wasn't some saint. He made enemies, dangerous enemies. And if you keep digging, you're going to get Philip killed. The way she said his name, the way her eyes darted toward the hallway where he slept, it lit a fire in me I didn't know I had. You stay away from him, I snarled. If you ever come near my grandson again, I swear. She cut me off with a laugh, a sharp, broken laugh. You think you're protecting him? You're just putting a bigger target on his back. For a moment, the mask slipped completely. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, and I saw it, fear. Not just of exposure, but of something larger, darker. And then she was gone. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, leaving the air thick with menace. I sank into a chair, shaking. My heart pounded, my mind spinning. She was unraveling faster than I'd expected. But there was something in her words, something about Mark's enemies, that gnawed at me. Was it possible? Was she lying again? Or had she tangled herself so deeply with his debts that even she was afraid of the people circling us? Either way, one thing was certain. Vivian was no longer hiding. She was fighting, and I was ready to fight back. It's only someone who supports injustice that would read this far and still stay quiet. If you want to see how this ends, if you want to stand with me against people like Vivian, then subscribe. Because silence lets people like her win. And the courthouse in downtown Columbus has always struck me as cold. Gray stone steps, heavy wooden doors, echoes that seem to carry every whispered fear. I'd walked past it dozens of times, but walking into it that morning felt like stepping onto a battlefield. Vivian was already there when I arrived, seated beside her lawyer. She looked polished again, like she had clawed herself back together overnight. Hair smoothed, makeup flawless, pearl earrings catching the light. But her eyes betrayed her. They darted around the room, sharp and restless, as though waiting for the ground to crumble beneath her feet. Philip sat beside me, his small hand tucked in mine. He'd drawn strength in the past weeks, his silence giving way to fragments of words, pieces of the truth. I had debated whether to bring him, but the judge needed to see what she had done to him. Needed to see the hollow in his gaze, the trauma etched into an 8-year-old's face. When the bailiff called us to order, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might shake the walls. Vivian's lawyer spoke first, painting her as a mother under attack. This is a woman who has been vilified by rumor and gossip, he said smoothly. She has been subjected to harassment by her former mother-in-law, who cannot accept her son's failings. My client is the only parent this child has left, and she deserves to retain custody. I almost laughed. Custody. She wasn't fighting for Philip. She was fighting to control the last piece of leverage she had left. When it was my turn, my lawyer laid out the case. The missing person report, the financial irregularities, the attempts to cash in the life insurance policy, the threats left on my door. And then came the drawings. One by one, I slid them forward. The basement shadows, the figure with jagged edges, the stick figure lying on the ground while another loomed above. each one a silent scream from a child who couldn't yet put words to what he'd seen. The judge leaned forward, studying them, his brows furrowed, his expression heavy. "This child witnessed something," he murmured. Vivian shifted in her seat, her composure cracking just slightly. And then came the moment I will never forget. Philip tugged on my sleeve. His small voice carried through the hushed courtroom. "She hurt Daddy." A gasp rippled through the room. My throat closed, tears burning my eyes, but I stayed still, letting his truth hang in the air. Vivian's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is hearsay." But the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "Sit down." For the first time, Vivian's mask shattered. Her face drained of color, her lips trembling. She leaned toward her lawyer, whispering furiously, but the damage was done. The judge called a recess. As people shuffled out, Vivian collapsed into her chair, her body shaking. Her lawyer tried to steady her, but she pushed him away, muttering under her breath. I stood nearby, watching her. And then, as though the weight of everything crashed down at once, she broke. "I didn't mean to," she blurted, her voice cracking. Heads turned. Even the bailiff froze. He wouldn't stop. He kept threatening me, saying I'd lose everything. I just wanted him to listen. Her lawyer grabbed her arm, hissing, "Stop talking." But it was too late. The words hung heavy in the room, undeniable. She had confessed. Not the full story, not yet, but enough. Enough for the judge to order Philip placed in my temporary custody. Enough for the whispers in the gallery to turn into certainty. Enough for me to finally feel the scales of justice tipping toward my side. As I walked out of that courtroom, Philip's hand in mine, I felt lighter than I had in months. But I also knew this wasn't the end. Vivian hadn't told the whole truth. Her desperation, her talk of dangerous enemies, the shadow of Mark's debts, it all lingered like smoke after a fire. Still, for the first time, I felt hope. The truth was coming, and when it arrived, it would burn everything she had left. If you were sitting in that courtroom, hearing an 8-year-old whisper the truth, watching a mask shatter in real time, would you feel pity for her? Or would you feel what I felt, a surge of justice long overdue? Tell me in the comments, because I've wondered whether anyone else would see it the way I did. The weeks after the courtroom battle passed in a haze. Vivian's confession, ragged, broken, but undeniable, set everything in motion. The police could no longer dismiss my pleas, no longer chalk Mark's disappearance up to bad debts or a man skipping town. They dug deeper this time, and what they found confirmed my darkest fears. Mark's blood in the shed. Vivian's fingerprints in places she couldn't explain. A trail of financial desperation that led straight to his life insurance policy. But the most damning piece came from Philip. With gentle care from a child therapist, his silence began to unravel. Word by word, he pieced together the nightmare he had witnessed. An argument in the shed, his father shouting, Vivian screaming back, something heavy in her hand. The sound of a crack. The silence that followed. And then, his father lying still on the ground. He hadn't understood it all then. But he understood enough. And now so did the world. Vivian was arrested on charges of second-degree murder. The news spread quickly. Her mugshot plastered on every local station. Her name whispered not with admiration, but with disgust. The woman who once polished her life to perfection was now exposed, raw and broken for everyone to see. I wish I could say I felt triumphant, that I stood taller watching her led away in handcuffs. But what I felt was heavier, because even as I stared at her, I couldn't stop thinking of Mark, of the boy I raised, the man who stumbled, the father who adored his son. His story ended on a cold concrete floor, and no amount of justice could bring him back. Still, I owed him the truth, and I owed Philip a future free from the shadows of betrayal. The trial stretched into winter. The defense tried to spin Vivian as a victim of Mark's gambling, a woman who acted out of fear. But her own words in the courtroom, the confession she couldn't take back, hung around her neck like a stone. The jury deliberated for just 2 days. Guilty. When the verdict was read, I squeezed Philip's hand. He didn't fully understand the weight of it, but he understood one thing. His grandmother had kept her promise. She had protected him. After the sentencing, I took Philip to Mark's favorite spot by the Scioto River in Columbus. We stood there together, the winter wind biting our cheeks, and I told him the truth. Not every detail, but enough. Your daddy loved you, I said softly, and nothing she did can ever take that love away. Philip nodded, clutching my hand. I miss him. So do I whispered. We dropped a small wooden toy boat into the river, one Mark had carved when he was a teenager. I watched it drift, bobbing gently against the current, until it was swallowed by the water. A goodbye. A promise. Life after the trial was quieter, but not easy. Vivian's shadow lingered in every corner, a reminder of how greed and betrayal had ripped a family apart. Yet slowly, piece by piece, Philip and I began to rebuild. I enrolled him in counseling, signed him up for Little League, filled our home with as much laughter as I could manage. The drawings he made shifted too. No more shadows, no more jagged figures. Instead, bright colors, smiling faces, the sun shining overhead. Healing didn't come all at once, but it came. And for me, I learned something I hadn't wanted to face. Revenge doesn't heal the wound. It doesn't bring back the dead or erase the pain. But it does bring something else, clarity. A stripping away of the lies until only the truth remains. Vivian thought she could bury that truth under money, manipulation, and fear. But in the end, the truth burned hotter than any of her lies, and it consumed her. I still wake some nights, reaching for a phone call that will never come. I still look at Philip and see the man his father should have been there to raise. But I also see strength. I see survival. And I see the unbreakable bond between a grandmother and her grandson, forged in fire and betrayal, but carried forward in love. So, if you take anything from my story, let it be this. When the world tells you to stay silent, don't. When fear tries to smother the truth, fight. And when betrayal threatens the innocent, do whatever it takes to protect them. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from the system or from those sworn to uphold it. Sometimes it comes from the relentless love of someone who refuses to stop fighting. And that's what I did. For my son. For my grandson. For the truth. The nightmare ended with Vivian behind bars. But the story of survival belongs to us. It's been months since the trial ended, and still I wonder. If you were in my shoes, would you have fought this battle the way I did? Or would you have let the system run its course, even if it meant silence? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear how others would carry a weight like this. And before you go, let me say this. It took countless hours, sleepless nights, and more tears than I can count to piece this story together for you. If you followed it this far, don't leave without subscribing. Because sharing these stories isn't easy,